Struggling waiter fired for serving Messi, then Messi changes his life. How will this story escalate? To find out, watch the video to the end. But first, please subscribe to my channel and turn on notifications to get more stories like this. The dining hall glittered under the warm golden light of the chandeliers, a picture of elegance and refinement. Guests in expensive suits and glamorous dresses murmured in low conversations, their laughter blending harmoniously with the gentle clinking of silverware against fine china. Every table was adorned with crystal glasses and delicate floral arrangements, an atmosphere designed to impress. For most people in the room, this was just another high-class evening, an opportunity to indulge in gourmet cuisine and mingle with society's elite. But for Diego, it was another night of struggling to keep up with impossible expectations. Diego had been working as a waiter at La Royale for nearly 6 months. It was one of the city's most exclusive restaurants, a place reserved for celebrities, business moguls, and foreign dignitaries. The clientele was demanding, the management was ruthless, and the pressure was relentless. Every shift felt like walking a tightrope. One misstep, one spilled drink, one delayed order, and the consequences could be severe. Yet, Diego had no choice but to endure it. He needed the job. His mother was sick, and her medical bills were piling up. His younger brother was still in school, and with their father gone, Diego was the only one providing for the family. He had already worked in countless restaurants before landing a position at La Royale, and even though the work environment was brutal, the pay was slightly better than anywhere else. But tonight, something was different. Tonight, he had been assigned to a VIP table, one of the most important ones in the restaurant. He took a deep breath as he approached the elegantly set table. The guests were already seated, a mix of well-known faces from the business and sports world. But one man, in particular, stood out. Lionel Messi. Diego's heart nearly stopped. He had grown up idolizing Messi, watching his matches on a tiny second-hand television with his brother. The idea that he was now serving him in person was surreal. But there was no time to be starstruck. He had a job to do. "Good evening, gentlemen," Diego said with the most professional tone he could muster. "Welcome to La Royale. It's an honor to serve you tonight." Messi glanced up, offering a polite nod. His presence was surprisingly unassuming despite the aura of greatness that surrounded him. The other men at the table engaged in quiet conversation, but Messi simply offered Diego a warm, genuine smile. Diego went about his task with careful precision, making sure every glass was filled, every dish was delivered perfectly, and every request was met with immediate attention. He could feel the eyes of his supervisor, Mr. Alvaro, burning into his back, watching for any mistake. Mr. Alvaro was the kind of man who thrived on intimidation, and Diego had been on the receiving end of his wrath more times than he could count. As he set down a plate in front of Messi, his hand shook slightly. He cursed himself silently, willing himself to remain steady. But Messi, ever perceptive, seemed to notice. "Are you all right?" he asked quietly. Diego blinked, momentarily thrown off. Customers rarely spoke to the waitstaff unless they had a complaint. "Yes, sir," he replied quickly, forcing a smile. "Just making sure everything is perfect." Messi studied him for a moment but said nothing further. Diego hurried away, feeling strangely rattled by the brief exchange. As the night progressed, everything seemed to be going smoothly. Diego made no mistakes, ensuring that Messi and his guests received flawless service. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he might make it through the shift without incident. But then it happened. A guest at another table accidentally bumped into Diego just as he was carrying a tray of wine glasses. The sudden jolt sent the glasses tumbling, and before he could react, they crashed onto the floor, shattering into 1,000 glittering shards. The restaurant fell silent. Diego's blood ran cold as he looked down at the mess. Panic clawed at his chest. He knew what was coming. Mr. Alvaro stormed over, his face a mask of fury. "What do you think you're doing?" he hissed, his voice dangerously low. "Do you have any idea how much those glasses cost?" Diego opened his mouth to explain, to say that it wasn't his fault, but he never got the chance. "You're done," Mr. Alvaro snapped. "Get out." Diego's breath caught. "Please, sir, it was an accident." I don't care," Alvaro interrupted, his voice dripping with disdain. "You're a liability. I should have fired you weeks ago." Humiliation burned through Diego. He could feel the eyes of the entire restaurant on him. The whispers, the judgment, the quiet amusement from some of the guests, it was unbearable. And then, a voice cut through the tension. "That's enough." The room turned toward the speaker. Messi. He had risen from his seat, his expression calm but firm. "This wasn't his fault," Messi continued. "I saw what happened. Someone bumped into him." Alvaro's face darkened, but he forced a tight smile. "Mr. Messi, with all due respect, this is a matter of staff management." Messi crossed his arms. "No. This is a matter of fairness." The restaurant remained silent. No one dared to interrupt. Alvaro clenched his jaw. "With all due respect, sir, you are a guest here. This doesn't concern you." Messi raised an eyebrow. "You fired him for something that wasn't his fault." "That concerns me." Diego couldn't believe what he was hearing. Messi was standing up for him. Alvaro exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "I have a business to run. If I kept every incompetent waiter, I wouldn't have the reputation I do." Messi's expression hardened. "Reputation? You think firing someone unfairly makes you look professional? Because to me, it makes you look cruel." A ripple of murmurs spread across the restaurant. Guests exchanged glances, clearly entertained by the spectacle unfolding before them. Alvaro, realizing that he was losing control of the situation, turned back to Diego. "Fine. You're fired either way. Get out of my restaurant." Diego felt his stomach drop. This was it. He had lost his job. His last hope of keeping his family afloat was gone. But then, Messi did something no one expected. He reached into his wallet, pulled out a thick stack of bills, and placed them on the table. "If you're going to fire someone over something this ridiculous," Messi said, his voice steady, "then I don't want to support your business." Alvaro's face drained of color. He opened his mouth to protest, but Messi wasn't finished. "I was going to tip him anyway," Messi added, motioning toward Diego. "But now? Consider this my way of making sure he gets something better." Gasps rippled through the restaurant. Diego stood frozen, his eyes locked on the money Messi had just laid out. Alvaro looked like he had swallowed a lemon. He glanced around at the other guests, some of whom were now watching with amused smirks. He knew that this was not a battle he could win without damaging his restaurant's reputation further. Messi turned to Diego. "You deserve better than this place," he said. "Go find something where they actually respect you." Diego's throat tightened. He wanted to say something, anything, but the words wouldn't come. Messi gave him a small nod before sitting back down as if nothing had happened. Diego stared at him for a long moment before finally finding his voice. "Thank you," he whispered, his hands shaking. Messi didn't need to respond. His actions had already spoken louder than any words could. And with that, Diego turned and walked out of La Royale, not as a man who had just lost his job, but as someone who had just been given a second chance. A chance that would change his life forever. Diego stepped out into the cool night air, his heart still racing. The humiliation of being fired in front of a packed restaurant clung to him, but beneath that, a strange sense of relief settled in. He had spent months walking on eggshells, dreading every shift, fearing that one mistake would cost him everything. And now, it had finally happened. He had lost his job. But the way it happened, that was something he could have never predicted. He opened his trembling hands and looked at the money Messi had given him. It was more than he had made in weeks. Enough to cover rent, groceries, and a little extra to keep his mother's medical bills from piling up for at least another month. But what meant even more than the money was the fact that someone, Lionel Messi, of all people, had stood up for him. Diego took a deep breath and wiped at his eyes before he could let the emotions overwhelm him. He needed to figure out his next move. He couldn't just stand outside La Royale looking lost. He had a family to think about. Just as he was about to turn and head home, a voice called out behind him. "Hey!" Diego spun around and, to his shock, saw Messi himself walking toward him. His first instinct was to apologize. I'm sorry for all of that back there," he stammered. "I never wanted to cause a scene." Messi waved a hand dismissively. "You don't need to apologize for anything. You didn't deserve what happened." Diego shook his head in disbelief. "But why did you step in for me? You didn't have to." Messi smiled slightly. "Because I know what it's like to be underestimated. To have people doubt you, treat you like you're less than them." He shrugged. "And I don't like seeing good people being treated unfairly." Diego swallowed hard. He had grown up watching Messi's rise, seeing how people had doubted him because of his height, how he had fought for every opportunity he had ever gotten. And yet, he had become one of the greatest footballers in history. Messi glanced at the money in Diego's hands. "That's just to help you for now," he said. "But tell me, what do you actually want to do?" Diego blinked, caught off guard by the question. I don't know. I've always just worked whatever job I could to support my family." Messi nodded thoughtfully. "Well, if you could choose? If money wasn't the problem, what would you want to do?" Diego hesitated. He had never allowed himself to think about that. His entire life had been about survival, about making sure his mother and brother had what they needed. Dreams had never seemed like a luxury he could afford. But then, a memory surfaced. "When I was younger, I wanted to be a chef," he admitted, almost embarrassed. "I used to cook with my mom all the time. I loved it. The idea of creating something that made people happy, it felt like magic." Messi smiled. "So, why didn't you go for it?" Diego let out a humorless laugh. "Life happened. My dad left, my mom got sick. I had to take whatever jobs I could get." Messi was silent for a moment, then said, "You should go for it." Diego looked at him in disbelief. "It's not that simple." "Why not?" Messi countered. "You have the skills. You've been in the restaurant business long enough to understand how it works. You just need a chance." Diego shook his head. "No one's going to take a chance on a fired waiter." Messi's eyes glinted with something unreadable. "Maybe they will." Before Diego could ask what he meant, Messi reached into his pocket and pulled out a small card. "Call this number tomorrow," he said, handing it to Diego. "Tell them Messi sent you." Diego hesitated before looking down at the card. It had a name and an address, one he didn't recognize. "What is this?" he asked. Messi grinned. "A chance." And with that, he patted Diego's shoulder and walked away, disappearing into the night. Diego stood there, staring at the card, his heart pounding. He had no idea what he had just been handed, but one thing was clear. Messi wasn't just giving him a tip. He was giving him a future. The next morning, Diego woke up earlier than usual, the small business card burning a hole in his pocket. He had barely slept, turning the events of the previous night over and over in his head. He still wasn't sure if he should call the number. Maybe it had just been a kind gesture, nothing more. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized he had nothing to lose. Taking a deep breath, he picked up his phone and dialed. The line rang twice before a deep voice answered. "Hello?" Diego cleared his throat. Hi. My name is Diego. I was told to call this number, by Messi." There was a pause. Then, the voice said, "Messi? As in Lionel Messi?" "Yes," Diego said quickly. He gave me your card last night." Another pause. Then, "Come by at noon. The address is on the card." The line went dead. Diego stared at his phone. That was it? No explanations, no details? Shaking his head, he quickly got ready, nerves twisting his stomach into knots. A few hours later, he found himself standing in front of a sleek, modern building with tinted windows and a golden sign above the entrance that read, El Cielo, Michelin-starred dining. His breath caught. Michelin-starred. This was one of the most prestigious restaurants in the entire country. People spent months on a waiting list just to get a reservation. And now, he was standing outside, completely out of place, wearing his best, but still very modest, button-down shirt and slacks. Swallowing hard, he stepped inside. The moment he entered, he was met with the rich aroma of sizzling butter, fresh herbs, and something smoky. The kitchen was in full swing, chefs moving with military precision, plating dishes that looked like art. Diego? A man in his early 50s, dressed in a pristine white chef's coat, approached him. He had sharp eyes and a commanding presence, the kind of person who had seen it all. Yes, sir, Diego said quickly. The man steadied him for a moment. Messi told me about you. Diego wasn't sure what that meant. He did? The chef nodded. Said you worked at La Royale but got fired unfairly. Diego clenched his fists, shame creeping up his neck. The chef held up a hand. Relax. Messi doesn't just vouch for anyone. That means something. Diego swallowed hard. I don't understand. Why would Messi? The chef smirked. Because he's a good man. And because he believes in second chances. Diego felt his heart pounding. What does that mean for me? The chef crossed his arms. It means you start tonight. Diego's eyes widened. What? You want to be a chef, don't you? The man gestured toward the kitchen. Prove it. For a long moment, Diego couldn't speak. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. But then he took a deep breath, straightened his shoulders, and nodded. Yes, sir. The chef clapped him on the back. Good. Get an apron. You're going to learn from the best. As Diego stepped into the bustling kitchen, something inside him shifted. Last night, he had been fired. Today, he was starting a new life. And it was all because one man, a legend, had seen something in him worth saving. Diego had never worked in a kitchen like this before. The moment he tied his apron and stepped inside, he realized he had entered an entirely different world. Every station was alive with movement, chefs chopping, searing, plating, all working in complete synchronization. There was no yelling, no chaos, just quiet efficiency, as if the entire kitchen was a single organism moving toward perfection. The head chef, Alejandro, wasted no time throwing him into the deep end. You start on prep, he ordered, handing Diego a knife and a cutting board. We need onions, garlic, and herbs prepped for the evening service. Make sure everything is uniform. Diego nodded quickly, rolling up his sleeves. His hands were steady as he picked up the knife. This wasn't like being a waiter. He wasn't running from table to table, trying to avoid the wrath of an arrogant boss. This was creation. This was something he had always dreamed of. As he began slicing, he felt the weight of every moment that had led him here. The countless nights spent in his mother's kitchen, watching her cook with care and precision. The way she had taught him to respect every ingredient, to let the flavors speak for themselves. And now, here he was, standing in one of the finest kitchens in the country, about to prove himself. Not bad, Alejandro commented after glancing at his knife work. But faster. We have orders to fill. Diego nodded and picked up the pace, his heart pounding. He had no room for mistakes. Hours passed in a blur. He worked through prep, moved to the salad station, and even got a chance to plate a few appetizers under the watchful eye of the senior chefs. It was exhausting, but exhilarating. For the first time in years, he wasn't just working to survive, he was working towards something. By the end of the night, his hands ached, his feet were sore, and he was drenched in sweat. But when Alejandro clapped him on the back and said, "Not bad for your first day," he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time. Pride. As he untied his apron, he noticed his phone buzzing in his pocket. He pulled it out and his breath caught. A message from an unknown number. "Messi, how was your first day?" Diego stared at the screen, disbelief washing over him. Messi still remembered? He actually cared enough to check in? His fingers trembled as he typed back. "Diego, hard. But amazing. Thank you." A few moments later, another message came through. "Messi, keep going. The best things take time." Diego exhaled, his chest tightening. He had been given a chance. Now, it was up to him to make the most of it. Weeks passed, and Diego threw himself into his new life. Every day was a test, every night a battle to prove that he belonged. The kitchen was relentless, but he refused to back down. He learned knife skills, how to balance flavors, how to plate dishes so beautifully that they looked like art. Slowly, he gained the respect of the other chefs, and even Alejandro, who rarely gave out compliments, started to acknowledge his work. One evening, as they were cleaning up after service, Alejandro approached him. "You've got potential," he said, crossing his arms. "But potential isn't enough. You need to keep pushing yourself." Diego wiped sweat from his forehead. "I will." Alejandro studied him for a moment, then nodded. "Good. Because next week, I want you on the hot station." Diego's heart nearly stopped. The hot station was where the main dishes were cooked, the steaks, the seafood, the pasta. It was one of the hardest positions in the kitchen, and only the best worked there. "You think I'm ready?" he asked, barely able to believe it. Alejandro smirked. "We'll find out." Diego barely slept that night. He was nervous, but more than that, he was excited. This was his chance to prove himself. When the day finally came, the pressure was more intense than anything he had ever felt. The moment the first orders started coming in, the kitchen became a war zone. Flames roared from the stoves, pans sizzled, and the sound of orders being called never stopped. "Diego, fire 2 steaks, medium rare." Alejandro barked. Diego moved quickly, grabbing the steaks, seasoning them perfectly, and placing them on the sizzling grill. He kept his eyes on them, timing everything just right. When they were ready, he plated them with precision and sent them out. Minutes later, a server returned with a message. "Table 12 loved it," she said with a grin. Diego exhaled, relief flooding through him. He had done it. He had truly become a chef. That night, as he was packing up, Alejandro approached him with a rare smile. "You handled yourself well tonight." Diego grinned. "Thanks." Alejandro nodded, then hesitated. "There's something you should know." Diego frowned. "What is it?" Alejandro crossed his arms. "Messi didn't just send you here as a favor. He owns a part of this restaurant." Diego froze. "What?" Alejandro smirked. "Yeah. He's a silent investor. He's been keeping an eye on your progress." Diego's head spun. Messi had done more than just help him find a job. He had placed him in a position where he could truly succeed. And all this time, he had been watching, making sure Diego had what he needed to grow. "Why?" Diego whispered, still in shock. Alejandro shrugged. "Maybe he saw something in you. Maybe he just believes in giving people a chance." Diego didn't know what to say. His entire life had changed because one man had believed in him. And now, it was up to him to prove that belief wasn't misplaced. A few months later, Diego stood in the middle of the kitchen, watching as the staff moved around him with effortless skill. He had worked his way up, earned his place, and now, he was about to take the biggest step yet. "Ready?" Alejandro asked, standing beside him. Diego took a deep breath and nodded. They stepped out into the dining room, where the restaurant was packed with guests. But there was one table in particular that made Diego's heart race. Messi sat at a private booth, watching him with a proud smile. Diego approached, his hands slightly shaky. I don't know how to thank you," he said. Messi chuckled. "You already did. By not giving up." Diego smiled. "I wanted to make something special for you tonight. Something that represents everything I've learned." Messi nodded. "Then I can't wait to try it." Diego returned to the kitchen, his heart full. He plated the dish carefully, making sure every detail was perfect. When he placed it in front of Messi, he held his breath. Messi took a bite. Silence. Then, a slow smile spread across his face. "This," he said, "is incredible." Diego exhaled, his entire body relaxing. He had done it. As the night ended, Messi stood up and clapped him on the shoulder. "I told you the best things take time," he said. "And this was worth the wait." Diego nodded, unable to hold back his grin. "Thank you. For everything." Messi smirked. "Don't thank me. Just promise me one thing." "Anything." Messi's eyes twinkled. "One day, when you own your own restaurant, give someone else the same chance I gave you." Diego felt a lump in his throat. "I promise." And with that, Messi walked out, leaving Diego standing in the restaurant that had once seemed like an impossible dream. But now, it was his reality. And he wasn't just surviving anymore. He was thriving. Because one act of kindness had changed everything. And it always would.